In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear." And this was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. Well, one of the most intriguing aspects in comparing the story of creation to what is often described as evolution, Darwinian style, is the unanimous opinion that the last creation, the greatest, most agree, that of man and his counterpart woman, the most developed creatures had come into being last, after all that had preceded before it, setting the timeline, even in Darwinian evolution. And this, in verses 1 through 10, is written in the book of Genesis, a very compact account regarding the introduction of the essential water on earth to create conditions for those lives and other forms of life, or to set the stage for abiogenesis in science, where we have left off in the last video installment. Did waters gather unto one place upon the earth? Did the seas come into being? Do you have a pandemic? Indeed, they did. And in most modern understandings of evolution, these conditions produce the primordial soup in which life began. Even if most modern scientists would agree that biological particles, like viruses, did not directly emerge from these primordial waters, but rather from mankind and other more advanced creations amongst the mammalian and avian species, and possibly the cephalopods, as genomic masses grew too large to support their undergirdings, imparting instability, just as sheep require a shepherd for shearing to remove their woolly coverings, lest they topple over and fall prey to the wolves. Did the dry land appear? Indeed, without question it did, and in most modern understandings of abiogenesis, from that primordial soup, more advanced creatures, such as the amphibians and reptiles, had migrated to the land, producing conditions for even more advanced creatures in the avian and mammalian species. So evolution theory and creation theory are not really all that far apart as the divisions in the great public debate on how life began in the Big Blue Marble Casino most call their present home here on Earth, raising at least a curiosity more about the actual genesis, the reasons that prompted the divisions amongst these advanced creatures on the very genesis of this place, placing at odds what some perceived as God's creation and their heavenly creator on a profession of faith. We began this video series in what may at least be described in a liberal construction as from an account of a notable science Dr. Richard Feynman, an astrophysicist from the prestigious Arlington University, in one of his rather popular works in which he attempted to extend his market brand, as they say, beyond the disciplines of science for which he had been noted as an authority to other aspects of life. In a book appropriately titled, "Surely You Are Joking, Mr. Feynman," And we had focused our crudely crafted lens upon one particular vignette to which one might give the title, in an expansive reading, The Devil and Dick Feynman, an encounter that he had as a scientist of impeccable credentials somewhere in the vicinity of Sin City, Las Vegas, with a wily Mephistophelian character presenting a Faustian deception, even upon approach, who had tempted him while he had been found lying by the waters of the pool, with an assumed sense of security at a motel, to seduce him to take a little plunge in some waters over his head, tempted by the allure of the life of leisure that this serpentine character by the pool had assured him that he had himself, even if it's not, at least from that account, appearing to be enjoying this assumed opulence at a location like the Venetian or the Bellagio, which should have provided some immediate signs of dangers he might await further out on that invitation to hop aboard a luxury cruise. Any kid growing up in far-off Rockaway Beach, Queens, should be familiar with the New York Lotto commercial, "Remember to bet with your head, not over it," at one of our fine convenient locations near you. Hello, my name is Major Mike Webb, and at least indirectly, as a retired member of the intelligence community, recently both the President and the United States Supreme Court have tasked me to report on a fascinating phenomenon. A fascinating phenomenon, which may be of great interest with as many as 3 in 10 Americans by December of last year identifying themselves as nuns, not affiliated with any faith denomination at all, up 6 points since the pre-pandemic estimate that had already found their numbers exceeding those affiliated with the Roman Catholic Church, which still remains the largest formal faith denomination. And in a community like Arlington, Virginia, that is the home of the most government scientists, with 75.3% of age-eligible residents holding at least a bachelor's degree, but where, according to Best Places, only 32.8% of the people in Arlington are religious, revisiting the battlefields of the 1925 Scopes monkey trial in Civil War, pitting Darwinian evolution against creation theory, most certainly what may fairly be described as a formidable challenge. Outnumbered, but certainly a timely one, after what has been described as a purely science matter that has most adversely impacted the faith community, if not touched upon politics, across the traditional wall of separation for the faith. It may be a timely opportunity to examine the relevance of faith in a modern post-pandemic period, in the aftermath of a 2-year period during which many places of worship, in the face of a public health crisis of unprecedented magnitude, of report even declaring themselves non-essential therein. And so, now where do we begin the seafaring journey? A daunting task, even today, for fishermen and sailors shoving off to the deep, as much as it was for ancients, fearing monsters, tempests, squalls, Scylla, and Charybdis. There have been conceived 4 classical elements of earth, wind, fire, and water. And you may be familiar with this from the 5th element, with which many modern spiritualists, even in the New Age astrology, living in harmony with nature, ascribe to being the 4 basic elements of personality, at least according to Padre, the self-proclaimed guardian angel, on December 16th, 2021 on his webpage, and those aspects of nature from which the basic disasters of earthquakes, tornadoes, and hurricanes, fires, and floods, acts of God for purposes of insurance and law, are derived. And water, our point of departure for exotic destinations and ports of call, features prominently in the Abrahamic faith traditions, from the book of Genesis and the creation to the great flood. It is transformed into wine as a sign of the coming in the New Testament. Its stirring is associated with healing power, as described in several miracle accounts. It is in the spittle that grants the gift of sight to the blind men, John the Baptist had an intimate connection with the waters, and even the Christian Savior chose amongst his 12 disciples a total of 4 fishermen, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, the sons of Zebedee, who made their living upon the waters before becoming fishers of men, but yet who had even displayed great fears when the storms were cast upon the waters, and navigation became more perilous and less safe. We left off during the last video with the question of the waters of the earth and from whence they came. And it seems that since this is something that we seek on other planets to discover signs of life, it would be important to discover exactly where that water came from to arrive here. Because if we knew how it arrived here, logically we would be able to figure out how it might get on one of these planets for life to begin. And Norman McLean, the son of a Methodist minister and the 1976 author of A River Runs Through It, had written the memorable words that are recited in the award-winning film directed by Robert Redford. Eventually all things merge into one, and a river runs through it. The river was cut by the world's great flood. It runs over rocks from the basement of time. On some of the rocks are timeless raindrops. Under the rocks are the words, and some of the words are theirs. And here, even in this rather poetic prose, penned by a son of a preacher man, there is infused a definite biblical reference to the account of the book of Genesis regarding the stories Noah and the flood, which you may choose to believe, interpret as metaphor, or even simply reject. Yes, as there is also at least an allusion to the New Testament, Johannine account, where in the beginning there was the Word. But one of the problems of comparing modern science interpretations to those professions of faith go far beyond different languages in which their purported truths are communicated in these debates about mechanics of abiogenesis with the Bible, talking past each other, not really communicating, and extend to the foundational bases for these distinct approaches to acquiring knowledge, with one derived from empirical observation and analysis, often associated with man's capacity for reason in an age of reason, and the other through what is often described in at least Christian theology as a divine revelation of the mysteries, as in this case through the words that appear in the scriptures. Truly a comparison between the classically proverbial apples and oranges, divided by an uncommon language, like those in the account in Genesis who dared to erect a temple at Babel in defiance of God. And in science, just recall your own elections with high school. Most would agree that long before a pandemic declaration, most were waiting with deep trepidation in waters far too deep and above their heads. For instance, the astronomer Galileo Galilei, who did battle with the church and even the Inquisition, to which he had been introduced, had cast his crude telescope up to gaze in empirical observation upon the biblical firmament, the sky, to observe the rings around Saturn, and more notably had attempted to explain the motion of the tides, suggesting that the gravitational forces of the moon had caused the ebbing of those tides, had died in the very same year that Sir Isaac Newton, who is known as the discoverer of gravity, that force, or at least the far more advanced understanding of this force, had so affected the movement of Galileo's conception of the tides. And noting the cumulative collection of knowledge in this ordered academic discipline of science, in 1675, in a letter to Robert Hooke, who had peered into his crude microscope and discovered the remnants of cells in a section of cork, comparing them to the rooms in which the monks and clerics dwelled, had written, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." And at each interval, what do we find? The aid of of technology. Men enabling themselves to see more, often with just crude mechanisms constructed with glass. But still seeing through a glass darkly. But for the scriptural literalist or fundamental Christian, the gravamen of the argument is one of authority, relying upon the authority of the scriptures to proclaim that God said. Need he say more? Very similar to the modern pronouncements and decrees of the president's top medical advisors. Granted a doctrine of infallibility, they say. Fauci said, and so it is written, so it shall be done. Similarly, in the July 2020 issue of Scientific American, Ed Turner, an astrophysicist at Princeton University, who had teamed up with his colleague, David Spiegel, and at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, to become the first to rigorously apply Bayesian analysis to abiogenesis, looking at the Frank Drake eponymous equation analysis, had to admit that at the time Drake wrote the equation down, or even 25 years ago, almost any of those factors could have been the ones that make life very rare, extinguishing the possibility of it even beginning. But he was still filled with the hope, even by July, despite years of listening for life above in the stars, not even one advanced civilization had yet to make contact with people here on Earth. He remained yet fully confident that, now we know, the worlds around stars are the norm, and those similar to Earth, in the most basic terms of size, mass, and insulation, are common as well. In short, there appears to be no shortage of galactic real estate that life could occupy. In the scientific community generally, in following a scientific method involving science, notwithstanding, and here held in abeyance, scientists rely upon the foundation of what had come before, even if sometimes in a myopia, not noticing those things that are missed, like the requirement for water to be on those abundant plots of real estate. And would it not be logical to figure out how water got here before going out into space to try to figure out if it is someplace else? But when it comes to the biblical account of creation, modern scholars continue to debate the traditional thought that Moses had ever written the first 5 books, referred to as the Pentateuch and the Abrahamic tradition. But most agree that these books would have been written by someone or someones between 1450 and 517 BC. If the argument is whether or not it's credible as an account, the who is not really all that important, but Aristotle would not be born until 384 BC, Socrates in 470 BC, and Plato not until 427 BC, a time before time, at least for modern evolved conceptions of intellectual capacity. So these would have been written even before the birth of the Hellenic or Greek culture, much revered even in biblical times, causing some division, as we can see inside the story of Hanukkah. Or quite simply, there were not giant shoulders of these credentialed authorities upon which even Moses could have stood. In the modern science sense, cosmopolitan Arlington, if he is assumed to be the author of the Greek Genesis account or anyone writing around that time. So immediately, didn't go to the right college. So immediately, the Bible has, for modern scholars, a credibility problem in what amounts to at least an intolerance for a different background, lacking in cultural sensitivities, a rejection of diversity and inclusion ideals, all of which are subordinated in a type of moral relativism where the end of victory will justify the end, apparently of record. And such is a common modus operandi amongst those who, as noted in the previous video installments, find an ally amongst the Satanists, intriguingly, who claim not to be a religion at all, intriguingly, but who, nonetheless, are opposed in this purely academic argument, primarily against those who just happen to possess, at least in proclamation, sincerely held faith belief. So in confusion, fear, and despair, advantages for those who can use them in battle, dividing like the waters from the land, the firmament, and the earth, so as to conquer. So if you are sitting in a pew and believe you are in a fair fight, the Bible does say that you had been sent as sheep among the wolves. So therefore be wise as a serpent. The name is derived from Genesis, if you may recall your Bible, and gentle as another image of a dove, another symbol from the book of Genesis, in those days after the great flood, when God had punished the earth for its evil and destroyed it. But that's enough skinny dipping in the kiddie pool for now. So let's pause here. But next time, let's cast off to swim with the sharks in the deeper waters beyond the safe harbors of the nearby shore, in science, and maybe even rock the faith of those without faith, just on this topic of water in our scientific immersion program. And be sure to join us in baptism and fellowship through communion, drinking the deep gulps gushing like rushing waters through those plank boards of this seagoing vessel that we rip away while at sea. A simulated drowning experience like on a waterboard. In the next video, as we discuss further the formula for being a winner at the big casino, and a story about a 1 in a trillion or more chance bet on a lifetime that was won nonetheless at this big blue marble casino, just relying on luck and serendipity with no choices at all, they say, but yet which apparently mankind could not do, even with the best technology and science, during a pandemic visited by a virus that isn't stupid, and still yet conquered the world without even a single sentient thought. This briefing is unclassified, as you were. My name is Major Mike Webb, and by God, I am running for U.S. Congress. This year resolved to do the right thing, and we shall make America great again. Honest. Carry on.
This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.
Thunk, I could have had a vaccine.